The Ottomans in the Renaissance were the single biggest threat in the world, and even afterwards they had huge influence. At times they had the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, Mesopotamia, the West Arabian coast, and North Africa. But by World War I, they lost a lot of their previous holdings, and almost all of their prestige. What could have possibly happened? We're going to find out. The first factor that led to the Ottomans' collapse were anti-Ottoman coalitions. In 1571, Pope Pius V formed the Holy League, an alliance between the numerous Italian states and Spain, made in response to the last Italian East Mediterranean stronghold being lost. They needed to cripple the Ottoman Empire, which they succeeded in doing in the Battle of Lepanto. This battle killed the Ottoman navy's best men and boosted Christian morale. And in the latter half of the 1600s, the Ottomans were advancing into Europe again. But at the Battle of Vienna, the tables turned in favor of the Europeans, and the Ottomans would never reach as far into Europe again after signing the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This would be further affirmed by future wars against Italians, Austrians, and Russians. Believe it or not, companies can also lead to the fate of empires. See, Europeans in 1600, 1621, and 1664 established companies for trade in the Indian Ocean, and even before that, Portugal had the trading post empire there. It's also worth noting that Spain discovered the Philippines in 1521, but anyway, this allowed the Christians to bypass trading with Muslims in the Ottoman domain. And even when there was a good primarily found in the empire, in some cases, they could get supplements from elsewhere in the world. Slowly but surely, their economy went into a slight decline, while the Europeans prospered. These coalitions and companies also led to another thing. The weakening prestige of the Caliph ultimately allowed the Janissaries to revolt. For context, the Janissaries were the children of non-Muslims, typically Christians from the Balkans, who were turned into slaves and forced into military service. And during the 17th century, they were able to get rights, for an example, having kids. They also joined guilds as the Ottomans waged less and less wars per century, and they still needed a living. Also, even before then, they guarded guilds and threatened them whenever they wanted to raise prices. But after the Janissaries alone had much difficulty crushing a revolt against Caliph Muhammad II, the Caliph was convinced that he must reform the military, and he abolished the Janissary class in 1826. Thus, the guild population began to melt. The final nail in the Turks' coffin was, of all things, the Industrial Revolution. Before that process, the Ottoman Empire was one of the first civilizations to utilize gunpowder weapons, and Europe was terrified largely because of that. This was the case for generations, until London decided to turn the world upside down with, you guessed it, the Industrial Revolution. Now the Christians had the technological advantage, and soon after, West Europe literally had to start a war to make sure Russia didn't waltz through the empire and threaten their colonies from India to Africa. By the way, that was the Crimean War. But with each of these four things, the Ottoman Empire couldn't stand a chance. The Ottomans were destined to fall, but they were still extremely resistant to collapse. It took centuries for these combined things to finally put down the Turks. The Holy League itself was actually a bit of a miracle, as all the members wanted rewards for their efforts, but the Pope was able to convince them to do it out of morality. It took multiple miracles to slowly take down the most powerful nation in the world, and that says something about what we can build.